So our application's been updated a little bit to have a bit more functionality. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, if I go and I try to create a user where there's no username, I'll end up getting this error. If I can end up creating users, and I can do this. If I attempt to create a user that's already been created, I get a different error. And I also have the ability to remove a user. So if I click on Larry, Larry goes away, and I could end up adding Larry back. So let's take a look at how this we ended up accomplishing this. And let's start by looking at the back end, and then we'll take a look and see what we did on the front end. So looking at the back end of the application, we've got really two files that we're working with. We've got our server, which is using Express and is taking care of our routes here. And we've also got our data layer, which is our DB. And one of the things that I did here is just to make this a little bit more useful, and also to show you, how Express ends up working. We see that when we end up requiring Express, we call a function. And I'm going to do something very similar here with my DB. So with my DB, I'm actually just going to make it a lot more usable. So we could use it for different sets of data and do different types of validation. You'll see that I'm requiring it, and I'm calling a function on it. So what this tells us is that when we end up using this DB, it's going to be a function. So our export must be a function, and we're passing in two things. We're passing in a name of a file, and we're also passing in a validator function. Again, we don't call this function. This function will end up being called for us. And I actually put another validator here too. We could always take this out, but just to show you this, if I was to go over here and put in a name that was too long, I'll end up getting name too long. That's kind of silly, so I'm going to end up taking it out here. And now if I ended up doing that, I'll see the name ends up getting added. So let's just take a look and see what this file looks like, and also a couple of other things that we're going to have to deal with when we end up using Express. So the idea here is that we end up exporting a function, and we're going to use closure, basically, where you're going to end up passing in a file and also a validator. So all the other code we have here is pretty much the same. Where basically when we go to write the JSON, we end up writing it out to the file. And again, it's important to see that what ends up happening here is that we export this function. The user, whoever's using this, calls this function, which they're doing over here, and they pass in these two pieces of data. And what do they end up getting back? So this function gets called, right? And this is a higher order function where we end up returning this function. When you call this function, you'll end up getting back three methods. And this is a little data layer that we're basically creating. Again, eventually we'll end up using a database, but this gives us the ability with a JSON file to find all of our records from that file, to create a user, and to destroy a user as well. So in terms of what internally is happening here, is that you'll end up getting back, whoever uses this will get back an object with these three methods. And if we look at what the three methods are, when they end up calling find all, what do? This is probably one of the easier ones. When we end up calling find all, we just end up reading the JSON file. And again, we've got the file based upon closure. So reading a file reads the JSON file. Destroy is probably one of the other easy ones to see. When you go to destroy, you pass in an ID. We're going to call find all. We're going to get all of our records. And we're just going to go and write back to the file the records that don't match the ID that's being passed in here. Create, probably a little bit more tricky. When we go to create, we pass in an item. We find all the items because we might want to validate based upon what the other items are. And so here, again, I'm making this configurable in the sense that when you end up using this, you pass in your validator function, and what we'll do is when create ends up getting called, we'll end up calling this validator function. If that validator function returns an error, we'll end up throwing the error. Otherwise, we'll end up determining an ID, we'll write the data back, and we'll end up returning the item. Now, it's not that you have to create this. This is, again, a fair amount of code that we have here. But if this was provided, then you could end up using this as a data layer with an Express application, which is something that you'll end up doing within the workshop. So let's just take a quick look at how this ends up getting used. Here, when we want to end up getting our users, we just call db find all, right? That's basically going to read the file and find our data. When we want to create a user, we call db create, and we pass in the request.body. Again, the reason why this works is that we're using our body parser here. We've got some middleware here that's doing some logging and that sort of thing. And when we go to delete, and this is something that's a little bit new, but we've looked at parameters on the client side. Express also allows us to put in placeholders so that all of our routes don't have to be their strings, but this is a placeholder that says, hey, look, I want to be able to call delete with an ID, in which case we end up using the ID. We end up getting the ID because one of the things that Express does for us is Express gives us a parameter collection with this particular ID, and we could end up calling destroy. And the only other thing that you're seeing here is that when something ends up getting destroyed, and you've seen this with APIs before, there really is nothing to return. So one of the things that we could end up doing with Express is we could specify, hey, look, we just want to send back this status of 204. You have the item that you destroyed on the front end, and we're just going to destroy it and tell you, hey, look, nothing really to see here. We could just control what the status is. And so just taking a look at that, if we look at our code that's being called here, if we were to go and open up our network tab, and let's clear this out. If I go to delete, I could see that I'm calling delete with an ID of 3. This ends up getting called with delete. And again, there's no response that comes back. And we could see we end up getting a 204. As opposed to, if I end up creating a new user, and I do this, I'll see that I've basically made a post request. Here's the data that's got sent over the wire, and my response is going to give me that user with their new ID. And the only other thing that we could take a look at here is in terms of how error handling ends up working. So if we go and attempt to add a new user that's got the same name that currently existed, let me actually open up my XHR tab, I'll see that I get back a 500, and I get it back with this error. The name must be unique. Let's just take a quick look and see where that happens for us, because one of the things we have the ability to do is we have the ability to put in some special middleware in Express. And the reason why it's special is that it's the one piece of middleware, meaning we're doing app.use and we're putting in a callback function, and it's got 4 parameters. So Express ends up looking, if there's an error, if next is called with an error, this piece of middleware will end up getting called in the Express pipeline. And again, we have the ability to do with it whatever we need to end up doing with it. And what we're doing with it here is we're saying, hey, look, yeah, this is an error. We're going to set it with a status of 500. And we're going to send back some JSON data so that we can process it on the front end with our React application. And we'll also console log it down here. So if I commented this out, things would be a little bit different here, because then what will happen is that Express actually has its own middleware that it ends up using. If I was to go over here and put in Mo, right, I would still see my error here, but Express is basically just going to do its own default thing with how it ends up dealing with that error. It's going to just basically send back an error page, and that's not too helpful for my application because I'm using React and I want to actually get this data in the form of JSON. So it's pretty common that, even though Express has some defaults, which are pretty good, we want to basically take control of that whole process. And again, this is done by putting an error handler in here. What makes it an error handler? It's got 4 parameters. Again, we don't call this function, but when this function gets called, we're going to end up using this error value. And when we end up doing this, we'll see that we'll actually get this back with a message. So with this information, what you're going to end up doing is building an application. And again, we'll give you this data layer, but you'll be able to configure the data layer, and you can end up doing it with a different type of data set using a different file name and that sort of thing.